Time now just coming up to 8:20. Good morning. It has been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. More than 3,000 people died after being infected with HIV or hepatitis from contaminated blood products in the 1970s and 80s.
A public inquiry will publish its final report next month. And now the BBC has uncovered evidence that one of the UK's most senior haemophilia doctors gave infected blood to children, despite advising colleagues not to do so.
One of his patients later died of AIDS at the age of 7. Maria Davis has the story.
Oh, look at it, Cole. It's beautiful.
For 30 years, Colin and Janet Smith have been fighting for justice. Their 7-year-old son was one of the youngest victims of the contaminated blood scandal. Diagnosed with haemophilia when he was just a baby, Colin Jr. was treated with the pioneering drug Factor VIII, made from donated blood and championed by the leading haematologist, Cardiff-based Professor Arthur Bloom. The Smiths and others trusted him implicitly.
We were elated.
We were really chuffed at the time because he was a world leader in haematology. And he says, if you're going to be diagnosed as a haemophiliac, you couldn't pick a better time because modern treatments are brilliant.
In the 1970s and early 80s, Britain became reliant on imported blood products from America. Blood that was often sourced from people who needed cash, even prisoners who often carried infections. Drugs companies would pool tens of thousands of donations, so just one infected donor could contaminate an entire batch. There were many warnings that untreated US blood products should be withdrawn. But we can reveal that Professor Bloom had ignored his own department's guidelines that children should only be given blood products from the UK. 3 months later, Colin was treated with imported blood products anyway. We've also discovered that the drugs company Immuno, which made Colin's Factor VIII, used high-risk blood from America, and the UK was prepared to buy it simply because it was cheaper. Colin and Janet knew nothing about this.
It is possible to sell Factor VIII concentrates produced from US origin at lower prices than European material because of the preference in the UK market for this lower priced material.
Money.
Saving pennies again. It's basically treating them on the cheap. They weren't worried about people's health, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, you get to a stage when you read things like that, to us, it was murder.
Professor Bloom died in 1992, but one colleague and haemophilia specialist acknowledges some practices were often questionable, even unethical.
They had a product that they were making a lot of money from, and they had stopped selling it in the US, but they had big stockpiles that they were selling in the UK. And
even though they perhaps knew the risk?
Although they knew the risk by then. The companies took a view that almost a view that, well, the haemophiliacs are expendable, we'll just go on selling this product.
By the mid-80s, cases of AIDS were increasing and the media attention intensified, with government messaging that in many cases left victims feeling ostracised. Tom and Meg, not their real names, chose, like many, to keep his illness a secret. They've spoken to me now on condition of anonymity. Why did you feel the need not to tell the truth over those 40 years?
In the beginning, it was because of all the backlash that was involved with it.
Tom, who first received American-made Factor VIII when he was 13, remembers well the day he found out he'd contracted HIV.
There were like 8 of us in the waiting room to go in to see him, and that's the first time we were told that we actually had it. And not to tell anyone. That was the biggest thing that hit me. Don't tell anyone.
Keep
we don't want to frighten people.
Yeah.
Keep it to yourselves. And there's nothing can be done.
When little Colin's diagnosis became public, his dad lost his job and people turned their backs on them.
One day we got up and it says AIDS dead, written right across the side of the house.
Black paint. We were known as the AIDS family anyway.
Their son eventually developed AIDS, and having fought to bring him home for one last Christmas, they were with Colin when he died, aged 7, in 1990. After huge pressure, a public inquiry was finally ordered in 2017. When some victims received interim compensation, the government said it would respond fully to recommendations for wider compensation after the final report. The Smiths and all others affected by one of the biggest scandals in NHS history hope the report's eventual publication next month will bring the answers and the peace they fought so long for. Willow Davis, BBC News.
And we're joined now by Clive Smith, who is chair of the Haemophilia Society. And Clive, thanks for joining us this morning. Where are you up to with the inquiry in terms of finding out the answers that people have waited so many years for?
The answers from this decade-long campaign should be heard on the 20th of May when the inquiry publishes its final report in London. And the inquiry was supposed to report at the end of last year, but the inquiry report had to be delayed due to the weight of criticism that the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry intends to make. And considering that campaigners and victims have been hearing for decades that there was nothing wrong happened, that people received the best treatment based on the best medical advice at the time, I think we know that that line can no longer stand and will be heavily contradicted when the chair does publish his report.
Just take us through the inquiry. Started, in 2019?
Yes.
And we heard stories like this. That's one of many stories, isn't it, that have
Yes.
come out of the inquiry, which must be incredibly difficult to hear, but has been a process, a cathartic process for those that have heard them.
Yes, on the one hand, and we've heard that from Colin Smith's family and Brave family speaking out, because so many people have actually given evidence to this inquiry anonymously, because the stigma that comes from infection with HIV, in particular hepatitis C2, still casts a huge shadow over the community. And yes, on the one hand, it has been cathartic. People have been able to tell their stories for the first time, to be heard. They've been able to join together in London and actually just speak to each other, and around the country when the inquiry sat there, speak to people who are in similar situations because they've suffered in silence on their own. On the other hand, as we've seen from the evidence about Professor Bloom, people have found out things about their conditions from their medical records that they never knew, that they were being tested on, that they were being diagnosed with HIV and not being told, men in particular being infected with HIV and then going on to infect their partners with HIV, who then went on to die, or being advised to abort children because they were pregnant. And finding out all that information and finding out that it was avoidable, that it was a result of doctors taking decisions not to pass on that information, I think is chilling and callous, and that's been incredibly difficult to deal with.
There's been interim compensation paid, I think, of £100,000
Yes.
to victims. What is the bigger picture when it comes to compensation and the final settlement? How is that decided? When can people expect to receive it?
Well, last year, the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, in April last year, over a year ago now, the chair published an interim report recommending that compensation be paid and a body be set up by the end of last year. People are still dying at the rate of 1 every 4 days as a result of infections. And he said, in all conscience, I couldn't sanction any further delay, and told the government to get on with it. They've not. They keep telling us they're working at pace. They've not brought forward any legislation themselves in the same way they have in the post office scandal, for example, to resolve the issues there. It's had to be piggybacked onto the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which is currently before Parliament. And so the government are just not getting on with it. And I think there are two aspects to the compensation. Firstly, there are the people out there who desperately need this money because their lives have been devastated, their families have been devastated. The generational harm that this has caused has been significant. But secondly, those people who died decades ago, and the money actually won't mean very much to them in terms of being able to do anything with it, but it will mean recognition of their loved one's loss, of the pain and suffering they've gone through.
The inquiry's report is due next month. What are the victims of this scandal? What do they want from it? Is it for people to be blamed? Is there for a sort of further sense of somebody being held to account?
Very much so. Sadly, the victims of this have known the truth for decades, and what they want is for the public and everybody to know that too, but also the government to recognise that. For the government to recognise that the United Kingdom should have become self-sufficient in the late 70s and early 80s in the production of blood products, which would have meant we wouldn't have needed to import blood products from the US, where it was infected with HIV because it was sourced from prisoners and drug addicts and the like, and the fact that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't have been sourcing the blood products from there, And then the fact, of course, that the doctor should not have been prescribing that to patients too. So sadly, the community's known the truth for years, and they want everybody else to know the truth too. And they want an apology too, a sincere apology, a meaningful apology, and they want redress.
Okay. Clive, thank you so much for talking to us. Clive Smith, Chair of the Haemophilia Society, thank you. And you can learn more about this story from BBC Wales Investigates, which is on this week.
Yeah, you can watch Blood Money on Monday at 8 p.m. on BBC One, or it's available on the iPlayer right now.